Okay, so we have been talking about liberty thus far, and our next installment here is going to be liberty as applied to a republican government versus a democracy. And what I would like to share is a model in which we can sort of create a spectrum in which anarchy is on one side and a dictatorship on another. So a dictator, right? Dictas in Latin means to speak, right? So a dictator is one man rule because he is the guy who speaks for everybody. Anarchy, which the founders and a lot of ancient historians would say is the tendency of democracy, is an order in which there is no rule, right? In other words, it's the exact opposite, where every man rules himself. Everyone, rules himself. So in an anarchy, there are no rules because one man or person cannot overrule another. I would suggest, and this is kind of where we're going, liberty is somewhere in the center. Because obviously you can't have liberty under a dictatorship, right? So in our own experience, we fought a revolution against the King of England. But on the other hand, if everybody gets to do and say and believe and whatever they want, then we get into this sort of thing. So where do we get this balance? First of all, let's talk a little bit about the anarchy of democracy. And for that, let's look at Thucydides. I'm picking up right here. This is from Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War. He says, revolution thus ran its course from city to city, and the places which it arrived at last, from having heard what had gone before, carried to still greater excess the refinement of their inventions, as manifested in the cunning of their enterprises and the atrocities of their reprisals. Note this, and I point this out, and as I go back and I read this again, I first started reading Thucydides 20, 30 years ago. This didn't jump out at me, but this next section really does now. Let's give it an attentive listen. Words had to change their ordinary meaning to take that which was now given them. Reckless audacity came to be considered the courage of a loyal ally. Prudent hesitation, specious cowardice. Moderation was held to be a cloak for unmanliness. Ability to see all sides of a question, inaptness to act on any. Right? So Thucydides is saying here that in times of chaos and revolution, right, there is no more moderation. Right? Notice he said reckless audacity became the courage of a loyal ally. So in other words, it's not so much about loyalty, or loyalty has come to mean reckless audacity. So in other words, the person who doesn't think but acts with reckless aggression becomes the good person, whereas the guy who sits back and tries to be prudent becomes the coward. Continuing right here. Frantic violence became the attribute of manliness. Cautious plotting, a justifiable means of self-defense. The advocate of extreme measures was always trustworthy. His opponent, a man to be suspected. To succeed in a plot was to have a shrewd head. To divine a plot, a still shrewder. But to provide against having to do either was to break up your party and to be afraid of your adversaries. In fine, to forestall an intending criminal or to suggest the idea of a crime where it was wanting was equally commended, until even blood became a weaker tie than party. From the superior readiness of those united by the latter to dare everything without reserve. For such associations had not in view the blessings derivable from established institutions, but were formed by ambition for their overthrow. and the confidence of their members in each other rested less on any religious sanction than upon complicity in crime. The fair proposals of an adversary were met with jealous precautions by the stronger of the two, and not with a generous confidence. Revenge also was held to more account than self-preservation. Oaths of reconciliation being proffered on either side only to meet an immediate difficulty, held good only so long as no other weapon was at hand. But when the opportunity offered, he who first ventured to seize it and take his enemy off his guard thought this perfidious vengeance sweeter than an open one, since, considerations of safety apart, success by treachery won him the palm of superior intelligence. Indeed, it is generally the case that men are readier to call rogues clever than simpletons honest, and are as ashamed of being the second as they are proud of being the first. So what is he saying? Well, in times of, anarchy here, when faction is so ripe, when moderation is gone, when compromise is gone, here comes the strong man, right? And so whichever side you're on, party becomes more of a tie than even our own families, right? So in other words, our political attachments become so violent that we can't even talk to the other side. So much so, here he said in the last few sentences, right, is that it becomes more honorable to lie about a deal and screw over your opponent than it does about trying to actually come to a workable solution. The cause of all, I'm in the next paragraph. Don't worry, this will be the last paragraph we look at from this. The cause of all these evils was a lust for power arising from greed and ambition. And from these passions proceeded the violence of parties once engaged in contention. The leaders in the cities, each provided with the fairest professions, on the one side with the cry of political equality of the people, on the other of a moderate aristocracy, sought prizes for themselves in those public interests which they pretended to cherish, and, recoiling from no means in their struggles for ascendancy, engaged in the direst excesses. So in other words, what's he saying? So here comes the leader, right? I guess you could call this the populist, who sees the tension between rich and poor, basically, right? As he says here, between the moderate aristocracy and the political equality of the people, right? And he exploits that. He exploits that tension for his own excesses. Continuing. In their acts of vengeance, they went to even greater lengths, not stopping at what justice or the good of the state demanded, but making the party caprice of the moment their only standard, and invoking with equal readiness the condemnation of an unjust verdict or the authority of the strong arm to glut the animosities of the hour. Right? So again, gone is any semblance of sticking to an overarching, just plan. Instead, by caprice. In other words, by, the changing impulses of the moment become the most important thing. Thus, morality was an honor with neither party. But the use of fair phrases to arrive at guilty ends was in high reputation. Meanwhile, the moderate part of the citizens perished between the two, either for not joining in the quarrel or because envy would not suffer them to escape. So Thucydides here is giving us, fair warning about the evils of democracy, because in democracy, what begins to happen is that there's no order, which is what anarchy is all about, right? And so it's a time in which passion and personal interest overwhelm the good of the whole. Now, obviously, here we didn't read Thucydides for dictatorship. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on dictatorship because I think you know what a totalitarian government means. But this side might be a little more difficult because, in America we have come to use this term a lot. because I think we've we've equated this democracy kind of with everyone rules himself, right? More and more we hear things like, I should be able to do whatever I want, think whatever I want, say whatever I want. And we're confusing, that sense of extreme democracy with liberty. Because remember, if we go back to our tripartite soul, right? It's only through reason that we can attain liberty. Whereas what happens over time is that in the interests of doing, what we want to rule ourselves, wait, this is supposed to be appetite. The vast majority of people will go for emotions and appetites. In other words, given freedom, remember how Kant had said that freedom will allow us to be rational? Well, it turns out perhaps that freedom actually makes us less rational because we tend to use that freedom to ingratiate our pleasures. Let's look at some things the founder said. Here's some quotes from the Federalist, and I put in red the ones I want to look at here. Federalist number 9. A firm union will be of the utmost moment to the peace and liberty of the states, as a barrier against domestic faction and insurrection. It is impossible to read the history of the petty republics of Greece and Italy without feeling sensations of horror and disgust at the distractions with which they are continually agitated, and the rapid succession of revolutions, etc. In other words, what? These Greek democracies, and historically it's very true, yes, we hold them up as, freedom and that sort of thing, but they destroy themselves in violent civil war and faction. Here's a very famous one, Federalist 10. This is sort of like Madison's statement really on the American political philosophy. He says, from this view of the subject, it may be concluded that a pure democracy, by which I mean a society consisting of a small number of citizens who assemble and administer the government in person, can admit of no cure for the mischief of faction. A common passion or interest will, in almost every case, be felt by a majority of the whole. A communication, a concert, results from the form of government itself, and there is nothing to check the inducements to sacrifice the weaker party or an obnoxious individual. Hence it is that such democracies have ever been spectacles of turbulence and contention, have ever been found incompatible with personal security, the rights of property, and have in general been as short in their lives as they have been violent in their deaths. Okay, so this is what the founders think about democracy. There's another good one here. Federalist 41. This picture of the consequences of disunion cannot be too highly colored or too often exhibited. Every man who loves peace, every man who loves his country, every man who loves liberty ought to have it before his eyes that he may cherish in his heart a due attachment to the Union of America. I want to come back to that sense of union. Anyway, in the interest of time, let's look at one more. There's always so much cool things to read. Here's what they had to say real quick about the Greeks. From these facts, this is, number 63, Federalist 63. From these facts, to which many others might be added, it is clear that the principle of representation was neither unknown to the ancients nor wholly overlooked in their political constitutions. The true distinction between these and the American governments lies in the total exclusion of the people in their collective capacity from any share in the latter, and not in the total exclusion of representatives of the people. Okay, so what's he saying? So he's saying that at the end of the day, the American system is based on representation, right? And that's what a republic is, representation. Because the people themselves are too given, ultimately, to emotions and appetites, and cannot rule themselves. That's the whole thing. And when we cannot rule themselves, when we can't rule ourselves, then we destroy other people's rights, trample on them. So liberty really is about not being anarchic.